Letras Libres presenta Ciberdiálogos con León Krauze.
Queridos amigos, ¿cómo están? Me da mucho gusto saludarlos. Bienvenidos a nuestros ciberdiálogos. Gracias por escuchar nuestro podcast o gracias por seguir estas conversaciones en formato de video en nuestro canal de YouTube. En cualquier caso, gracias por escucharnos, gracias por seguirnos, gracias por suscribirse a nuestro podcast, gracias por su respaldo, su apoyo. Es un placer y un privilegio trabajar para ustedes. El día de hoy, en nuestra última conversación de la primera temporada de nuestros ciberdiálogos, que concluye con esta charla, tuve el gusto de hablar con un periodista notable, Keegan Hamilton de Vice. Keegan es quizá el periodista que ha cubierto el dolorosísimo tema de la guerra contra el narcotráfico, la dinámica del narcotráfico y el crimen organizado en México, quizá el periodista que ha cubierto esa batalla de manera más valiente, más precisa en los últimos tiempos. Es un hombre que, como los grandes periodistas, no tiene miedo de nada, francamente. Una de sus últimas entregas, un reportaje a profundidad en todos sentidos del Cártel Jalisco Nueva Generación para Vice, es absolutamente indispensable. No solamente indispensable para entender el fenómeno del narcotráfico en México y el crimen organizado, sino también para aprender de periodismo. Es una lección de periodismo valiente, preciso, decidido. Keegan, en esta conversación que tuvo conmigo en Ciberdiálogos, tocó varios de los aspectos, variables centrales de esta batalla contra el crimen organizado, desde el inicio de la guerra contra el narco hace ya 15 años con Felipe Calderón, hasta lo más reciente, la visita de Kamala Harris a México para hablar de migración, para hablar de crimen transnacional, para hablar de la crisis de opioides, el fentanilo y demás. De todo eso hablamos Keegan Hamilton y yo. La conversación, creo yo, de verdad vale mucho la pena. Aquí está la última charla de nuestra primera temporada de Ciberdiálogos con Keegan Hamilton. A continuación. So, Keegan, it's been 15 years now. Mexico's drug war has lasted a decade and a half, and the consequences are brutal, frankly, staggering. At least 300,000 Mexicans killed, thousands more have disappeared. Has there been any progress, you think? How do you define progress in a conflict such as this?
I mean, progress is such a tough word when you're talking about statistics like those, with thousands disappeared, tens of thousands killed, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions displaced. If anything, it seems like it's only gotten worse since 2006 when Calderón launched the guerra, contra, narco. I think AMLO's strategy of trying to sort of pretend that the problem doesn't exist only works so long as there aren't flare-ups of violence and the cartels do their part in sort of keeping the violence quiet. And that has sort of been the case in some areas. Like you look at Sinaloa, for example, the violence there is lower than it has been in years past, in part because there's only really one group that's controlling things. There's no fight for that plaza. But then you look at somewhere like Michoacán, like Guanajuato, Tamaulipas, the list goes on of Mexican states that have just seen the violence get worse and worse and worse because there's a conflict between multiple, cartels fighting for those areas. So on one hand, I think AMLO has sort of taken a strategy that may appeal to the Mexican people in a certain sense, but on the other hand, like there's been nothing done to address the root causes of the violence, and no sort of concrete steps, policy changes that could conceivably make things better in the future. Right now, it's just sort of stick your head in the sand and hope that nobody notices what's going on.
As you well know, much has been made of Felipe Calderón's original decision to go to war against the cartels. It all began in Michoacán, his home state, a state that you have covered extensively. In hindsight, do you think Calderón was right in confronting the cartels the way he did it? At the time he did it, do you think he was right?
You know, I interviewed Felipe Calderón about this a couple of years ago, and his reasoning for it, he stands by his decision and sort of argues that things were getting out of control before he launched the guerra contra narco, and that it was critical for Mexico to reestablish the rule of law. And I think that in sort of a vacuum is true. Mexico has to reestablish the rule of law, has to end impunity, has to hold, cartel members who are responsible for horrific crimes accountable. Now, however, you look at the results of what's happened, it's clear as day when you look at the murder rate in Mexico that deploying the military only caused violence to escalate, and it's just gotten steadily worse since then. I think what needs to happen is a rethinking of the militarization. You can't, hugs not bullets, as abrazos no balazos, as AMLO is not sort of the other end of the spectrum, and that's not practical in and of itself. But there has to be sort of a middle ground strategy of demilitarizing, rethinking drug laws, and also ending impunity and, making sure that people who are committing crimes are being arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And Mexico just right now doesn't have either of those things.
What was the alternative? Calderón always comes back to this question when confronted with that original decision. He always says, what was the alternative? Was there an alternative? I mean, when you think of Michoacán back then and even now, but back then, a state where a parallel structure was being constructed, parallel to the Mexican state almost in every way. What was the alternative, you think?
I mean, I think the alternative is what you're seeing now from AMLO, and that's to pretend that the problem doesn't exist. Sort of let business continue as usual, hope that the cartels keep their business in the shadow and don't spill so much blood that it attracts international attention and, outrages the citizens enough to vote, people out of office. Mm-hmm. That being said, it's if you're looking at this in terms of polls, like one response is just to deploy thousands of soldiers like Calderón, and the other one is pretend the problem exists. I think there's probably a sweet spot in the middle where you are, not fighting the war. I think this whole framing of like war is problematic and contributes to the problem. But at the same time, you can't, let criminals, especially mass murderers, get away with it. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be, I think, targeted enforcement, and there needs to be a dramatic overhaul of Mexico's judicial system, because right now it's really, really, really hard, virtually impossible to actually take someone from an arrest to a prosecution and a prison sentence. Yeah,
impunity has been a crisis in Mexico for a long time. Now, let me go back to the original strategy that Calderón put in place and Peña Nieto kept. The strategy basically, I mean, this is simplifying it, of course, but it was basically to capture or kill cartel leaders, for decapitate the organizations and hope that would weaken them. For years, we saw this continuous and very dramatic manhunt in Mexico. Did it have any impact? Was it a wise strategy?
Well, it wasn't a wise strategy, clearly, as we can see, judging from the results and the fact that the cartel problem is worse than ever in Mexico and that tens of thousands of people have lost their lives. In terms of what, Calderón had in mind his stated mission of sort of destroying these cartels from the top down, some of those organizations really don't exist anymore. Los Zetas are sort of tremendously fractured in Northeast Mexico. The Caballeros Templarios in Michoacan, which is sort of what Calderon was going after, doesn't really exist anymore. The problem that Calderon found is that, if you take out one cartel, it doesn't mean that the drug trade goes away. It just means somebody else is going to step up and take their place.
The Hydra theory, no?
You chop off one head, there's going to be 6 more that pop up. And in Michoacan, that's precisely what's happened. I mean, you've seen a resurgence of La Familia. You've got Jalisco cartel there now. All these different sort of local groups, whereas before one organization controlled more or less the whole state, now it's sort of municipality to municipality with different control among those organizations. The other, of course, thing that needs to be said when you're talking about Calderon and his war, his guerra contra el narco strategy, is that we now know that some of the highest level officials in his administration were allegedly on the payroll of the cartels and sort of working to take out their enemies. So any sort of posturing by Calderon that this was entirely aimed at destroying all the cartels, we now, we had our suspicions at the time, and now in hindsight, evidence has come to light that this was in some ways a campaign to help certain cartels while targeting others.
You've drawn this contrast in our conversation between Calderon's strategy and the strategy that apparently President López Obrador has embraced, this idea of hugs, not bullets, right? Abrazos, no balazos. A couple of years ago, that strategy was put to the ultimate test in a way when Mexican forces captured Ovidio Guzmán in Culiacán, and the Sinaloa cartel frankly unleashed hell. I mean, the scenes that we saw were terrifying, and I'm going to ask you about them specifically. But López Obrador then chose, and now we know that he personally decided to free Ovidio Guzmán. What message did that send?
I mean, I think that sent a pretty clear message that the cartels, especially the Sinaloa cartel, on their home turf, are as powerful as the Mexican state. The fact that soldiers could capture someone like El Chapo's son and then be forced to release him, in part because the cartels were threatening the family members of those very soldiers who had him captive. I think that it sends a crystal clear message that impunity is still the law of the land, and that even when they are able to locate and capture somebody, it's not worth anything if you can't hold that person. And it should also be said that wasn't a totally isolated incident. That one involved the most high profile figure in Chapo's sons, and it got a ton of international attention because the videos and photos that came out of Culiacán that day were so striking. But in Michoacan, there have been reports of high level Jalisco cartel members who've been captured and released. It seems to happen, more commonly than people are aware of.
Give me the alternative version of that story. What would have happened if the Mexican armed forces had made the opposite move, and President López Obrador had made the opposite decision? Do you think we would have seen all-out war in Culiacán? Was it morally the right decision, even if in the overall strategy it probably sent a terrible message? What do you think of the alternative version of that story?
That's a tough question. I mean, López Obrador was in a tough spot there. I mean, if they continue to hold Ovidio Guzmán, who knows what terror they would have unleashed on Culiacán, and what would have happened to all the families of the soldiers involved in that operation. Who knows how long the Culiacán airport would have remained closed because gunmen were surrounding it. It's really hard to say, how much worse that could have got. And I don't sort of envy AMLO for being put in a position where he had to make that decision. I think the better question, and maybe more importantly, is what could have been done differently so that they didn't put themselves in that situation. There have been other successful captures of high level drug lords, including El Chapo himself, where they successfully detained him, held him, prosecuted him, and that means prosecuted, extradited him to the United States. So I think it comes down to sort of planning and execution from the top down, from López Obrador, the Guardia Nacional, and all the forces that were involved in that operation that allowed them to be so exposed and unprepared that they had to make that decision in the first place. And from what we now know about that, it seems like it was sort of an early effort by the National Guard to sort of make a name for themselves, make a splash, and show that they could capture somebody like Ovidio Guzman without the help of Serena, without the help of the Army or the Marines. And now that just looks like a huge blunder in hindsight. And it's clear that you need that sort of high-level cooperation and the firepower and experience that a group like the Marines bring to a capture operation.
Speaking of firepower, it is obviously impossible to understand the violence in Mexico without American guns. For example, in Culiacán, and this, I remember these scenes perfectly well, and I'm sure you do too. We saw Barrett 50 rifles positioned on corners chosen at random, I would imagine, literally blowing soldiers away, because the effect, as Joan Grillo explained to us in this podcast a few weeks ago, the effect, the impact of a bullet this size on a man's leg is just, shattering. How important for this dynamic are guns smuggled from the United States? How important are those guns for the cartels? If you take that away from the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, if you take those Barrett 50 rifles, if you take them away from the Culiacán cartels, this sounds like an obvious question, but at times I don't think it is that obvious for some people. How important are those guns for these cartels?
Yeah, I'm consistently surprised in talking with friends, colleagues here in the United States that people don't understand how difficult it is to legally obtain, just straight up to obtain weapons in Mexico. That's, it's not like the United States where there's a gun store all over the place. And the data from the ATF in the United States and from Mexico's own reporting shows anywhere from 70 to 90+% of the guns used in Mexico are, coming from the United States and being smuggled across the border. You mentioned the Barrett 50 caliber sniper rifle is a particularly striking one we've seen more and more showing up in cartel propaganda videos as sort of like a status symbol or a particularly intimidating gun that they like to show off. And yeah, the bullets in those rifles are the size of a carrot and can, take down a helicopter or disable a truck engine. Incredibly, you can just buy that legally in the United States. Anybody, you don't even need a background check, depending on where you are, to walk into a store and walk out with that rifle. And then from there, it's a pretty easy process of dismantling the gun into parts, hiding in a vehicle, smuggling it across to Mexico. So I think, it's really easy for the U.S. to say, why isn't Mexico doing more about the drug problem? Why can't they get these cartels under control? But the weapons are the clearest example that this is a binational problem and that the U.S. has to do its part in not only controlling the supply of weapons, but reducing the demand for drugs. As long as Americans are going to continue to enjoy cocaine and methamphetamine and marijuana and all these other drugs that the cartels supply, they're going to figure out a way to ship it there. And they're going to figure out a way to get guns from the U.S. because that's what they need to continue to control territory and run their businesses.
Kamala Harris visited Guatemala and Mexico recently, and she spoke forcefully on immigration and crime and met with both presidents, but there was no mention at all, no mention at all of this issue of gun smuggling. Apparently, behind the scenes, she conveyed how worried the administration is about fentanyl trafficking and security in general, but again, no mention, at least publicly, of the issue. How can that be?
I mean, guns are a really difficult political issue for Joe Biden right now. I mean, it's such a lightning rod for some voters. It's a single issue for single issue voters, where anything that the Biden administration does to sort of regulate guns, that makes a certain segment of the American population very angry and reactionary. So I think Biden understands which way the wind is blowing, and that a growing majority of Americans support common sense gun control. But on the list of things that Biden wants to get done and spend his political capital on, gun control is one that is sort of high risk and potentially highly damaging to his political causes. So I think Biden personally would, from what he said publicly in the past, supports more gun restrictions, more gun laws, but either it's too soon, or he just thinks it's not possible in Congress right now to get some sort of gun control legislation passed. And there are some things that he could do as president to sort of issue executive orders, but at the end of the day, that's really not going to make much of a dent in the types of weapons that are being sold to Mexico. You're talking about semi-automatic rifles, semi-automatic handguns, and there's no sort of realistic path towards restricting those types of weapons in the near future in the United States, unfortunately.
One should point out that that's not Biden's fault or the Democrats, frankly. I mean, it's the Republican Party who resists those kind of very basic measures of gun control. Now, Mexico just wrapped up its bloodiest electoral season in memory. Dozens of candidates across the country were killed, kidnapped. Some were killed in broad daylight, with utter disregard for everything, let alone human life. Everything, consequences. I mean, the level of impunity is just mind-blowing. What's behind the violence? How do you explain that sort of violence, which is not the normal kind of violence? We're talking about political violence.
I think more and more we're seeing that organized crime in Mexico is about hyper-local control. It's about who controls a city or a municipality or a state. And in Mexico, as you well know, the political system gives a lot of autonomy to state governors and to local governments. So when a criminal organization can install a leader who is friendly, or if not, outright, part of their organization, it makes doing business so much easier for them. If you can control a governor, a state government, it's basically carte blanche to sort of do business. And we've seen that play out. Look at like the governor of Nayarit, for example, who's in the United States facing international drug charges right now. I think as long as Mexican criminal groups rely on the plaza system, on territory, where having control of who goes in and out of your zone, having control over the municipal police and the state police, that at the end of the day is the most important thing for their businesses and for continuing impunity. So when you're seeing candidates killed, I think it's pretty clear that those are people who've refused to play ball or have chosen the wrong side.
I think it also proves why this particular war against organized crime in Mexico is just so difficult, right? I mean, Mexico is rotten. Brutal word, but I think it's precise. It's rotten at the municipal level. That's where the challenge really lies, really begins and really lies, right?
Yeah, I mean, look back to what happened with Ayotzinapa in the city of Iguala, and we now know that mayor was, hand in hand with the criminal organization that was operating in that part of Guerrero. And if that can happen there, and there has been a lot of fallout from that, but not a lot of accountability at the end of the day.
At all.
I don't see the situation changing until people can be really held to account for that. There needs to be actual consequences and justice. Justicia is the most important part of this conversation, and it's just utterly lacking in Mexico right now.
The most elusive word in Mexico, for sure. Let me ask you about the future. You have covered, like very few people, in an incredibly courageous and eloquent way, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. You recently published a remarkable piece that included conversations with leaders of the cartel. Let me begin this way. How dangerous is the CJNG, el Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, in the context of crime in Mexico and the region in general? How dangerous is it?
I mean, they're the fastest growing cartel in Mexico, and behind a lot of the violence, including some of that political violence that we were just talking about. How dangerous are they relative to something like Los Zetas were, or even Cartel de Sinaloa? I think they're sort of a mix of between those two, where there's a lot of hyper violence, and in the sense of the Zetas, like local franchising, where sort of criminal groups that already exist in certain areas are sort of being co-opted and flying the flag of CJNG. But they're more Sinaloa in the sense that they have this sort of massive international network, and they have almost monolithic power in some of the areas that they control. I mean, what we've been talking about impunity and justicia, there's, not a lot of that going on. I mean, Mencho is one of the most wanted fugitives in the world. And he's, on kidney dialysis, according to everyone, but Mexico still can't figure out, where that guy is.
They are very ambitious. They have tremendous firepower. They insist that they are liberators, right? They have this rhetoric that is so peculiar and, in my opinion, very dangerous, because it can be very appealing to people in places like Michoacán, like Jalisco. But what drives them? I think I could ask you could ask you that question just in general. But thinking specifically of this group that is so dangerous, what drives Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación? When you look at the whole combination of factors and you spoke to these people, what drives them?
I mean, in my conversations with them in Michoacán, the leader that we spoke to really framed themselves as being, we are the liberators of the pueblo. Like there are these criminal groups, local groups in Michoacán, sort of collectively known as Carteles Unidos, the United Cartels. And in Michoacán, the international drug trade is part of it. There's manufacturing meth, there's coastline for importing drugs. But for a long, long time in Michoacán, the problems have also been with extortion, with stealing crops and goods, affecting the local economy. And so the Jalisco cartel, rather smartly, I think, has sort of come in and said, look, we are just drug traffickers. We're not going to extort you. We're not involved in kidnapping. We don't do any of this local crime, which is questionable. I don't believe that entirely to be true. But as you said, that is a great message that can resonate with someone who's been paying extortion for years, or had someone kidnapped by the other side, and they can say, maybe these guys are better. And when I asked their leader in Michoacán about this, his sort of answer was like, look, we don't need to extort. We don't need to rob people because we're drug traffickers. We make all of our money from importing and drugs to the United States. And I huge kilo-sized grain of salt when he says that, but it is very effective messaging. And I think the only thing that's probably stopping them is that people are not dumb. They know that life under the cartel is not as great as they make it out to be, regardless of whether it's Carteles Unidos or CJNG.
And that's exactly my next question. in your experience as a reporter, in depth, how do people see the cartel? I mean, the cartel presents itself as liberators, and we are just doing this line of business, and we are going to protect you from these other criminal organizations, blah, blah, blah. When you talk to people in private, citizens under the cartel, how do people see them?
I mean, again, this goes back to it being a really hyper-local problem in some ways, a hyper-local issue where it comes down to family ties in a lot of senses. Like, you know, if somebody has a brother, an uncle, a cousin who is involved in one cartel, and therefore you might be a little more sympathetic to that side and more likely to believe the rhetoric that they're feeding, that they're actually going to help you and not steal from you or kill you at the first opportunity. But again, like, I think we interviewed a priest in Michoacan, a guy by the name of Padre Goyo, who really said it best, and that is, there is no such thing as the good cartel. It's on the government to go in and take out both sides. And any scenario where you're relying on the lesser of two evils to come in and sort of you're going to support that is wrong. That's flawed from the start. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's not possible right now. It's such an intractable problem that the Mexican government can't go in, you know, next week or next month and completely clean out the cartels from Michoacan. That's not realistic. But I don't think that there's going to be tangible, positive change until you get a government that won't support one side or the other, that is truly independent and just looking out for the interests of the local populace.
Let me ask you about two other issues. Let me touch on two last issues before I let you go. The opioid crisis is severe, very severe. Fentanyl alone has killed thousands of Americans. It is also very lucrative for the cartels. Apparently, Vice President Harris brought the issue to Mexico. I remember I asked López Obrador during the second presidential debate about fentanyl. Very few people have heard about fentanyl. I don't know if he had heard about fentanyl, frankly. And I asked him, what's your plan to put an end to fentanyl production and distribution? And he went to his favorite talking point, and he said, when corruption ends in Mexico, fentanyl will also, you know, he turned to that talking point for almost every question. Of course, the answer is much more complicated than that. Now that the issue is in the forefront, how do you deal with fentanyl? How big is the problem?
I think that the reason that the cartels have turned to fentanyl is strictly for profit purposes. It's more lucrative to import chemicals from China or India or somewhere else abroad, turn those into an opioid, and sell them to the United States than it is to pay campesinos to farm opium poppy plants. Mm-hmm. And it's just a straight up supply and demand issue in the United States. There's so much demand for opioids that the heroin alone was not going to meet that demand. And so fentanyl became a very lucrative way for them to sort of meet that American thirst for opioids. It seems insatiable. And I think rather than pointing the finger at Mexico and saying, why aren't you stopping this fentanyl from coming in? The United States needs to look at itself and say, like, why are we a country that has such high level of demand for this? And until the US can sort of get a handle on its own, you know, drug consumption problems, I think it's a little unfair to say that Mexico is the reason that the US is having this overdose crisis. Longer term, I do think it's an opportunity for AMLO or whoever is the next president of Mexico to reform Mexico's drug laws and sort of try to bring in some of the illicit market into a more regulated, controllable marketplace. Like there are all these, you know, poppy growers who have seen their livelihoods disappear in the mountains of Sinaloa, Guerrero, Nayarit. The price of poppy gum has plummeted and put those people out of work. I think it'd be a huge risk, but the reward of sort of bringing those people into a legal marketplace and increasing legal opium poppy production for medical purposes in Mexico is a tremendous untapped opportunity. And that's the sort of, I think, conversation that the next government or AMLO, as he finishes out his term, should be thinking of, is like, how do we change the paradigm and instead of thinking about this as a war and eradication and criminalization, how can we incentivize people to, come to the government, to be a part of this and make money in a way that helps the state and places that have extreme poverty, like the Sierra of Western Mexico.
Let me ask you about one of the main characters of Mexican recent history, a man who's out of sight, but certainly not out of mind. El Chapo Guzman. I, by the way, always resist calling him El Chapo. I always call him Joaquín Guzman, but, El Chapo Guzman. Emma Coronel, his wife, has just pled guilty. Why? What's going on with El Chapo and with his organization?
Well, El Chapo himself is, as you know, was convicted in 2019 and is serving out a life sentence with no chance of parole in the United States.
Yeah.
And he's under very strict conditions where his communication with the outside world is really limited. His wife, as you said, Emma Coronel, has pled guilty to her own drug charges that sort of said she was aware and had a sort of bit part in the Sinaloa cartel. The bigger problem with El Chapo is his sons, Los Chapitos, Ivan, Ovidio, Joaquin, and Alfredo, are all fugitives, all believed to be in the Culiacan, Sinaloa area and sort of running the family business, basically unchecked. I mean, El Mayo Zambada is still in the picture and a powerful figure in the Sinaloa drug trade, but Los Chapitos have taken over what their father left behind, and it's expanded their control over certain parts of Sinaloa. I mean, there's really running Sinaloa with an iron fist. Los Chapitos are these days.
And finally, Keegan, let me wrap up our conversation with an impossible question. When will violence in Mexico end? Is there a real path for our generation or even my children's generation to see a Mexico where this brutal elephant has left the room? Violence, criminal organizations like we've seen, this enormous and brutal elephant has left the room. Is there a scenario for that?
I don't think that all hope is lost. I think that in our lifetimes, we've seen this problem get worse and worse and worse. And there is, I think, ways that the Mexican state and the United States and other countries can approach the drug trade that would reduce the level of violence. And I'm talking about not necessarily full-on legalization, although I think that there is a great argument and debate to be had there, but less of this quote-unquote militarized approach of fighting fire with fire. There has to be some of that. There has to be justice. There has to be arresting, prosecuting, and imprisoning people who were responsible for the violence. That's, I think, any strategy starts with ending impunity in Mexico. But longer term, as long as there's an incentive as long as there's millions of dollars to be made to get into this drug trade, people are going to jump at that opportunity, even though, that money is only being made by a select few, by the El Chapos and the El Mayos of the world. When you have all of these youth with no real future to look forward to, where you don't have career opportunities, you don't have education opportunities, you don't have jobs that pay a decent living wage, that creates a tremendous incentive and pull to get involved in the drug trade. So I think Mexico not only needs to, overhaul its justice system and end impunity, but it also needs to look at sort of these economic root causes, education causes that are sort of also underpinning corruption. And these are huge, intractable problems. And so when you ask, like, is this going to happen in our lifetime or our children's lifetime? I think it's more likely the latter. But I think that we collectively as a society right now are reflecting, thinking really hard about this drug trade, the drug war, and how it came to be. And it is an opportunity where we can start that sort of transition to a new future now. And hopefully maybe 10, 15 years from now, that'll maybe bear some fruit. But in the immediate near term, it looks really bleak. I can't lie to you.
Keegan, felicidades por tu trabajo, todo mi respeto, mi admiración por el trabajo que haces como periodista, como colega. Gracias por tu tiempo. Such a pleasure being with you today, man.
Gracias a usted.